I want to try to contextualize a bit why we are here as people who work in the cultural industry, and why we resist from that position. So I've been thinking a lot about how culture is crucial in the production of life and in the production of death. So culture then is not uninvolved in the devastation that we see unfolding in Palestine. It is not uninvolved in ongoing genocide, settler colonialism, and it's not uninvolved in the material conditions of Palestine at the moment. So we're talking about a place where it will take maybe about more than a decade to rebuild. The Lancet says 186,000 deaths attributed to Israeli action. People are at risk of starvation, hepatitis, jaundice, every kind of disease you can imagine. And so, for me, I wanted to start with the importance of struggling from a kind of cultural space and a cultural sphere, I guess. And I wanted to start, Yara, with a quote actually from you and Sarah Bernstein, where you say, "The idea that the writer's work is undertaken in solitude is perhaps what leads to the persistent misunderstanding of art as separate from political life, or as politics as an interruption of the pure aesthetic life of art. But we know this, literature's material is the world. It's not separate from it." So I guess my first question is, we know that that distinction doesn't exist, but how, I guess, do we arrive at a space where responses to book workers making political demands to stop ongoing genocide are kind of labeled as misguided? And I guess, what is the purpose and effect of literary activism? How is culture intimately bound up in the Israeli government's genocidal regime through Bailey Gifford and other ways?
I'll start by talking a little bit about this idea that cultural life and politics are naturally separate or should be separate. It's an idea that is taken for granted, or at least seems to be taken for granted by large sections of the media and of the literary class establishment in the UK. But I'm not convinced they even believe it. So just for an example, I think Howard Jacobson called us a sort of mob, or maybe probably something worse. But, you know, he's been on Newsnight defending Israel. So the idea that when he does that, that's not political, but when we do what we're doing, that is, and that's inappropriate, and that is somehow at odds with the task of the writer, I'm not even sure that anyone believes it or that they believe it, and they certainly don't practice it. But the second thing, I think, is that if you claim as a writer, in particular a writer of fiction, that your writing is not political, all you are doing is failing to understand your own work. Because all writing is political. It's impossible for it not to be. When you disavow the politics of your own writing, all you are doing is being naive to how your writing actually works and what it is saying in the world. So I think we should always outright reject that claim and be suspicious of it. Because when we look particularly beyond the UK, it is so self-evident that that is not a given in other literary cultures. And, you know, if you think about in Latin America, why have writers been so often censored, and artists and musicians? And that is because politics is so often part of our literary life. It's always completely false to separate the aesthetic from the political. And we should be very suspicious of any kind of claim otherwise.
Can I add something to that? Yeah, something that I think is really important to point out as well is that it's not only that, because I agree, I don't think the literary establishment really believes in that separation between culture and politics. But there's a difference between the individual author-activist and authors as workers and organizers. There's a very big difference there. So publishing is actually very comfortable with commodifying activism and with presenting the author as an activist in what we write. So we will be platformed on stages to talk about Palestine, for example, and Palestinian authors will be platformed at festivals in the UK. But when it comes to questioning the underlying material conditions that make those events and that publishing industry possible, that is much more difficult. And I think part of it is to do with that kind of very individualistic idea of what writing looks like that you were mentioning, that when actually writing is a very collaborative kind of work in all forms, you know, that it takes many, many people to make a book, and it takes many, many people for that book to be read. But also that it's just very uncomfortable with the idea of authors as workers, because that also takes away some of the protective bubble in the self-image that the industry has of itself, I think.
I found it super weird coming into this and seeing people trot out over and over again this argument that art isn't political or art and politics are entirely separate, which I've always thought was very strange. And I think it's partly because people think of, you know, when you say X isn't political, they often mean like it's not to do with electoral politics, because we have this kind of shrunken, desiccated conception of what politics actually is, as well as having this kind of very individualistic understanding of the writing process. And I think people within the books industry are just as guilty as that of anything as anyone else, because it is this, you know, it's like the cornerstone of capitalism is this idea of kind of liberal individualism, that we are all these separate, isolated, atomized individuals maximizing our utility functions and competing against one another in a capitalist society. So the idea of like politics as something much broader than turning up at a voting booth and expressing your objective preference, choosing between these two political parties, and as something that is about more than, you know, maximizing your personal self-interest, is about kind of collective struggle, is about organizing, is about actually showing up and challenging power relations wherever you find them, which is really, you know, politics is these are just questions of power. So wherever issues of power come up, there's politics, and, you know, that's very clearly happening in the areas that we're campaigning. And I think that attitude shows up generally, and it also shows up individually, and we've discussed this, in the way that the people that we as Fossil Free Books have been interacting with respond to us with a mix of kind of puzzlement, confusion, fear. They're like, who are these people? How are they organizing with one another? Why are they doing this? Do they not value their careers more than they value these issues that they're fighting for? So yeah, I think it is this very narrow liberal understanding of what politics is as well, that is standing in our way.
I think it's also perhaps a misunderstanding of how money moves in an industry, right? Like the books industry is an industry, after all, that brought in about £7.1 billion in revenue only last year. And so I want you to help us kind of situate ourselves in this moment, kind of tracing the relationships between book production and investment in fossil fuels, thinking about fossil fuel extraction, thinking about even like Bailey Gifford, what is an asset manager? You know, how is the violence that they are complicit in, how is that connected to ongoing devastation that we are seeing in Palestine? Because I think for a lot of people, it's also about connecting the dots, right? Like, it's about what does my private experience, transformational experience of reading a book have to do with snipers in the West Bank, right? And I want you to try and help us kind of connect that by thinking about how money flows.
Yeah, I mean, it's so important for anyone involved in any divestment campaign, or I think in, you know, most campaigning generally, to understand particularly this idea of what an asset manager is. Because these guys, and there's three main ones that are really big, which is Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street. Actually, I think State Street is now merged. But they control trillions of dollars worth of assets. They basically control a huge amount of money. That is invested by people all over the world. So if you have a pension, you will be putting a certain amount of money into your pension pot every year, and that pension fund will then be going about trying to, you know, basically, you know, deliver a return that's going to, balance risk and return over the course of the time with which you've left that fund, that money. And part of that is going to involve handing over a big chunk of your cash to an asset manager like BlackRock, or as the case may be, Bailey Gifford. And these funds will then allocate that investment, you know, depending on what kind of fund they're using. Often it's just spreading it around across equities in an index like, you know, the S&P or the FTSE or whatever. And because we live in this very, very unequal global economy, and because for a whole host of reasons, There are not as many kind of profitable opportunities for investment as there have been in the past because governments aren't investing as much as they have been in the past. These asset managers have become immensely powerful. They control vast, vast sums of money, trillions of dollars worth of investments from people all over the world, from basically almost anyone who has savings, and also corporations that have money that are invested with these institutions, and sometimes even governments as well. So they really, they are huge allocators of investment. Now, this is an interesting conversation that we've been having over the course of this campaign as well, is that how do they decide how to make those investment decisions? Because what you're told when you confront an asset manager like Baillie Gifford, or indeed any of the asset managers that, the climate movement, for example, are coming up against as well, is they say we invest neutrally, based entirely on our assessment of what is going to deliver the right risk-adjusted return over the course of the time period that you're investing this asset with us. I.e., we're analysing risk, we're doing it very objectively, and we're trying to get you the biggest return subject to that analysis of risk. And there's lots of kind of legal structures that underpin their responsibility to do that. So Baillie Gifford would often come back to us and say, we can't meet your demands to divest because we have to invest in this way, which means that we're kind of minimizing risk and we're maximizing returns. We're legally obliged to do that. We have something called a fiduciary responsibility to do that. And that is true. They do have a fiduciary responsibility to maximize, basically act in the best interests of their shareholders. And what we were doing was actually challenging this idea that their role as institutions that were analysing risk, the risk that accrues to their investments of your pension savings, was basically not political and was neutral and objective. And we did that by pointing out that, having investments in fossil fuels at a time when the planet is burning and there is going to be, regulation, there's going to be a response to, the fossil fuel companies having these investments and potentially a kind of long-term decline in those returns is risky in a world where investing in, things that in booking.com, for example, or in many of the assets that we pointed out that they had that made them complicit in what was going on in Palestine, that was risky. And it wasn't really, they were quite confused as to how to respond to that argument, I think. But it is a really important one, I think, to bring forward in any divestment campaign.
Do you want to speak to
that? And just to bring the festivals into the picture as well. So Baillie Gifford used to fund, to sponsor 10 literary festivals in the UK, and it still funds one literary prize. And it was providing them with, in total, about £1 million a year, but some festivals as little as sort of £28,000 a year. So we're not actually talking about huge amounts of money for a festival to raise. And if you look at the amount of money in the publishing industry, like Lola said, their profit last year was 7 billion, and it's an increasing profit. And at the same time, the real terms pay of the median author has decreased from, I think, 12,000 to about £7,000 a year, which is a real terms pay cut of 60%. And starting salaries in publishing are also going down. So this isn't an industry that doesn't have money. It's an industry where money is extremely unevenly distributed. So there was one, if you look at Richard Osmond, his last advance was £10 million for 4 books. So he could fund Baillie Gifford's contribution to Hay Festival for the next 100 years. So when we talk about, so the question really is, how did these festivals get so reliant on one institution that they valued that institution and they would protect that institution above all of their writers, their workforce, the people actually making the literature that they exist to celebrate? And I think the reason that we were so successful is they forgot that we are their workers. There's no literary festival without writers. And if your writers find the way that you have paying for that festival morally unconscionable, and we withdraw our labour in solidarity with Palestinians, then you're going to have a problem when it comes to delivering and programming your festival.
I want to kind of... I want to kind of follow up on that point and come to you specifically, Jessica. So when we're talking about the power of authors and the radical strategies that they can use to stand in solidarity, the Society of Authors, which is like one of the leading kind of trade unions for writers in the UK, adopted a motion very recently demanding that the books industry divest from fossil fuels. And 85% of members supported that motion. But in the very same session, which we were all in, members rejected a motion calling for the recognition of genocide in Palestine and its specific impact on Palestinian writers, the cultural institutions, the destruction of cultural institutions in Palestine, and the murder and mass displacement of people. And I wanted you to kind of talk to us about or explain to us why these stances contradict each other, especially thinking about the role of fossil fuel extraction in Palestine. And this question of how Palestinian liberation is kind of intimately tied up with us resisting climate catastrophe everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, so to go back to how fossil-free books started, so it came about because in August of last year, in 2023, there was the Ferret, which is they do investigative journalism in Scotland, came out with an article that said that Baillie Gifford had up to 5 billion invested in the fossil fuel industry. So that's where we started. Then organizations such as Art Workers for Palestine in Scotland also unearthed that they had up to 10 billion invested in the occupation, genocide, and apartheid in Palestine by the Israeli government, the Israeli state. So for us then, in fossil-free books, there was no question about whether or not we would campaign for both. And that question, I think, is like at the very, very core of the response from then the Society of Authors. The reason why we did campaign for both was twofold. So one, because there was a fundamental understanding that environmental violence has always been part of the Israeli occupation in Palestine, and it is a huge, huge part of colonization everywhere. But also if you look at the actual fossil fuel industry, so the fossil fuel industry is currently profiting from the arms industry in Palestine. So they are profiting from the oil that goes in and then gets used by the Israeli military on Palestinians. But then also going the other way, so big oil and gas fields such as the Cambo field and the Rosebank field up in the North Sea, companies such as Ithaca Energy, which has a parent company that's an Israeli parent company, they are literally supporting the infrastructure in Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestine territories. So these companies are quite literally and concretely making their money from Palestinian lives. So then the question isn't like, why would you? The question is, why wouldn't you? Mm. And the interesting thing in terms of the Society of Authors, so the management committee from the beginning opposed our resolution on Palestine. And the reason that they gave for doing that was this relatively new policy that they've published, which says that they do no longer comment on issues of I think the wording is a more general political nature. Which is, I mean, you can go back, they commented on Black Lives Matter, they commented on Ukraine, obviously, but in terms of this particular context, it's also interesting because they supported the fossil fuel resolution. Mm. So, I mean, and that's, if you look at that the reason behind that is quite essentially white supremacy, because in what world or what allows you to see the climate crisis as apolitical? It's if you make it very vague and you talk about emissions rather than the actual communities that are being affected by fossil fuel extraction.
And the very real world consequences that we see, right? I wanted to try and also get your thoughts on situating fossil-free books within the kind of BDS boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. And yeah, I wanted to ask you, how do you relate the calls in terms of fossil fuel divestment and situate them within answering the call of Palestinian civil society? And I guess I wanted you all to comment on the fact that I think often people forget when people do these forms, when cultural workers especially do these forms of organization, that cultural boycotts have had enormous power in the past. So if we think about apartheid in South Africa, you know, there was a point in history where at least like 1 in 4 Britons said that they would be boycotting South African goods, right? So we know the power of culture, we know the power of BDS as a kind of movement. And so I'm interested in how you situate the work that you're doing within that broader call.
Yeah, I think the South Africa example is excellent because, you know, for decades, campaigners were fighting within all of these kind of formal institutional structures, within the UN, throughout, you know, various different international economic organizations for sanctions, fighting within governments, trying to make this an election issue. And it was only when this campaign became a kind of hegemonic cultural project, and also, crucially, when it did begin to target the economic interests of the South African state, and particularly actually the very close economic relationships that existed between South Africa and the UK, obviously in part a kind of legacy of British colonialism, that the tide really started to turn. And it was very interesting actually the way that the cultural and the political shifted together. So you had these two separate strands of work almost that were going on in the kind of broader movement for South African liberation against apartheid around the world. There was the kind of big P political movement, and it was like, we'll work in the UN, we'll work in our political parties, and we'll kind of try and do some good. And then there was the cultural movement that was saying, you know, we need to kind of bring artists together and really resist this movement in that way, you know, boycotting the Olympics, sport, etc. And it was really when these two movements came together, particularly when Thatcher and Reagan were both elected, both of whom had not explicitly but hinted towards their support to South Africa, that suddenly things exploded. And the cultural and the political came to reinforce each other very, very clearly. And it wasn't long before we did start to see some very significant movement on this from both of those political leaders, because they saw these shifts that were going on in society. Now, I think, you know, the campaign that we've been organizing, I think draws on those learnings, because we are thinking both in terms of how we organize as cultural workers, how we disrupt a cultural scene that is, if not profiting from, then certainly taking advantage of investments that are causing, you know, so much destruction all over the world, as well as really making clear that our demands are aimed at this institution. And we were very clear from the beginning, the demand is that Baillie Gifford divests. Yeah. And that, I think, it was almost lost in all the furore around how should literary festivals be funded and how are we all going to sustain the nice cushy jobs that we have running literary festivals. Our real core demand was that we were trying to attack the material foundations of the system that give rise to all of this death and destruction all around the world, as well as organizing cultural workers to kind of try and draw attention on that. And yeah, I mean, you know, we keep being asked whether or not we think we've succeeded. And we have created a lot of stir, and we've made a lot of people angry, and I think that is good because that needed to happen. But we still live in a world where, you know, the UK is in many ways the center of global finance, and many of the institutions located in this country are invested in companies that are profiting from Israeli occupation, apartheid, and genocide. Yes, Baillie Gifford, but a lot of other asset managers. And, you know, arms companies, BAE Systems, all located here. So it has to just be the start. Mm-hmm.
And Yara, do you want to speak a bit more to, I guess, the necessity of making that demand directly to Baillie Gifford rather than focusing, I guess, on them simply withdrawing as a funder from specific book festivals in the UK? Like the strategy behind that?
Yeah, so this isn't about moral purity and us keeping our hands clean and we just want to feel like we're not doing anything wrong. It's really about getting the fund managers at Baillie Gifford to go, people don't like our investments in not just companies that are on UN databases for human rights violations in Palestine, but also Google and Amazon. And I think it's been really important to shift how, basically attach much more stigma and a sense of risk to companies that people might think are just neutral. Okay, they run Gmail, they run Google search. No, they're providing the AI infrastructure for the bombing of Gaza that is causing this like devastatingly high civilian death toll. And we started, when we started, Baillie Gifford replied to us saying, oh, but this is only a tiny fraction of Google and Amazon's activities. And it's really important to be saying really loud and clear, it doesn't matter what their other business activities are. If a company is involved in a genocide, then we have to be talking about how investments in that company are completely unacceptable and risky. And the conversation has moved on that. So you look at, that was one of the Columbia encampment demands, was that Columbia divest from Google, Amazon, and other tech companies involved in providing services to the Israeli military. And then, 4 months later, this summer, Edinburgh University announced that it had suspended investments in those companies. So it's not a pipe dream, like Baillie Gifford said. It's something that can really be done. And the win is not necessarily the festivals dropping Baillie Gifford, but it's the fund managers sitting down and thinking about risk differently, but also everyone who has their pension invested in Baillie Gifford saying, oh, I didn't know that, maybe we should get in touch with them, maybe we should ask for that pension to be moved. So it's about also changing what is an acceptable investment and leading directly to divestment that way.
And supporting the workers in those companies as well, many of whom have actually stood up and said this isn't okay, or in the case of Amazon, are going on strike. So there's like that link too.
I was just thinking very briefly about your question on situating it within the wider divestment movement. I think a lot of this is also political education, because so few people in the book industry actually understand how divestment works, and that goes into the whole moral purity versus strategy question, right? That it's like you have your books on Amazon, because nobody cares, literally, if like I tell my publisher that I don't want my books on Amazon, like that, there is absolutely zero leverage. But we had leverage here. We could actually make a difference. And part of that leverage is also to do with what I was talking about earlier in terms of the self-image of the book industry. These are stages that are talking about these issues. Like, we are invited onto these stages to talk about the climate crisis or to talk about social justice. So that also creates a moral imperative for that money to be moved, I think.
I think also what all of your responses kind of demonstrate is obviously our fundamental interdependence as people, across industries, but also across borders, right? That like no industry functions without some kind of connection to another industry or connection to the exploitation of peoples, right? So like violence somewhere is violence everywhere, right? And I think that having that conceptualization of the political makes it much less easy for you to extract yourself from the problems of another place elsewhere, right? I wanted to kind of say that to say that also in the UK there is a huge, long history of artists, book workers, cultural workers doing that kind of political education, making political demands. I think about the Artists International Association, which was established in 1932, of which writer John Berger was a member, and that was kind of like an anti-imperialist, anti-fascist association. There are loads of other kind of organizations within the Black Art movement, etc. My question is coming. I think that two decades of austerity has kind of decimated the sector, as you've all said, but it's also shrunk imaginations in terms of what's possible with regard to internationalist solidarity. And so I wanted to hear your thoughts on like how we as writers reestablish the kind of lateral, horizontally structured unions, artist networks that enables us to keep those forms of internationalist solidarity with writers in Palestine, with cultural institutions across the world that come under attack in a kind of capitalist landscape.
Well, the good news here is there's some really low-hanging fruit.
Yeah.
So, like I said, the average writer is making £6,000 a year. We're getting paid £150 for going to one of these festivals sponsored by this asset manager. There's relatively little to lose here and a lot to gain if we got organised. And I think that's what we've shown. We just did not think we'd be this effective. We didn't think we'd bring the festivals to their knees, essentially, in terms of their programming so easily. And they really underestimated their labour force's ability to be organised as well. And I think there's a huge potential because people like having agency. People don't, it doesn't feel nice when the only thing you can do is tweet. it feels awful. And so what we found is like people were joining fossil-free books. You know, there are hundreds of us now. We didn't exist a year ago. And it's certainly, you know, it's the first time that writers in the UK, and not just as writers and just writers, right? Writers together with booksellers, translators, illustrators, publishing staff, have organised together as workers to withdraw our labour, and really quite gently withdraw our labour. Because you also had the option of going to a festival and reading a poem or making a statement. And it's been hugely effective. So I think essentially it's already happening. It's really exciting. There's everything to play for. You know, we're not well paid. The industry is hugely consolidated. It's a few big corporations that own everything and do a terrible job. I mean, Waterstone's software broke for like the whole of last year, and they didn't know where any of their books were. But because they have essentially a monopoly on in-person book selling in the UK, that was just that. So it's something really exciting that we can do when we combine workers' rights, solidarity with Palestine and everywhere in the global south affected by the climate crisis. And the climate crisis, yeah. Basically, when we bring all these things together, it's extremely exciting, and it feels really good to be part of that organising. So what do? I think we just keep organising together. We keep doing that political education, showing people, explaining to people that they are workers, and showing to them how powerful we can be when we organise as workers, and getting our industries unionised and militantly unionised.
I think that point that you made about imperialism and understanding the ways in which, you know, injustice somewhere is connected to networks of injustice that are exploiting and oppressing people everywhere, and need to suck that wealth that is being generated through those relationships back to the imperial core, is really important that we're highlighting this, that we are showing up these financial networks that suck wealth out of poor countries and can like suck them back to rich countries, that enrich shareholders and, you know, executives in the global north at the expense of devastating communities in the global south, whether that is through war or climate breakdown, is so important. And, you know, a lot of our job as activists and writers is doing that, is kind of casting lights on those links. But what I've noticed is that talking just about capitalism and its wrongs is demobilizing in a lot of ways and disempowering. And I think the left has been doing that very effectively for many, many years, talking about everything that's wrong, talking about how the system is completely broken. And we arrived at a point of kind of left nihilism in some senses, where you would recognize the just astonishing complexity and, by virtue of that complexity, resilience of this system that was so deeply unfair, and felt you were this tiny little cog within it with no capacity to do anything about it. Because yes, you recognize capitalist imperialism, but the way that you think is structured by individualism. So it's like, how do I fight back against the system? Maybe I can change my consumption habits. Maybe I can reduce my carbon footprint, which is of course what BP would tell you to do, because they invented the idea of carbon footprint. So like when we're talking about this campaign, is about highlighting, yes, these relationships that are so deeply wrong and unfair and unjust, but it's also about saying we have power to resist them. And it's like looking at the system from, you know, a macro level, but then saying, right, where do we have leverage? How can we come together and work with each other to disrupt this in all the little interstices where it's weak? And I think, you know, as you said, it's been super exciting and empowering, especially as someone who has been on the left talking about everything that's wrong with capitalism for a very long time, to actually be doing that and to feel like it's working.
Yeah, so I mean, your question was, like how can we? Yeah, I know that there was definitely a how there, and I think my short answer is by me being more than writers. Because there is something there about challenging the idea that writing is enough in an industry where writing is a commodity. But also, I also mean more than writers in terms of the working across the industry. Like I've also for 10 years, first as full-time and then part-time, I worked in independent bookshops. And in terms of the history of like radical cultural work in this country, I feel like sometimes bookshops are forgotten a little bit, because there is also a very romantic idea of what a bookshop is, which plays into that idea of like books as a naturally good thing and an intrinsically romantically good thing. But there are actually bookshop spaces that are doing really, really important work.
Thank you. Sorry, continue, please. Keep continuing.
So, like, what these spaces are doing is also questioning the neutrality of cultural spaces. So, if you actually, for example, want to support Palestine, that means curating, which doesn't mean censorship. It means you not only support and show Palestinian authors, but you also don't platform Zionists, for example. Just like if you want to be welcoming to people of color, then you platform people of color, you don't platform racists. And that isn't censorship, it's curation. And it's selection. And I think that is something that also gets forgotten a little bit, which is really, really hugely important. Yeah.
I think also, I think what organizing also does is, this is something you talk about quite a lot, Yara, is get rid of this idea that like literature is about a kind of humanistic, liberal empathy, right? It enables you to see your fellow workers across the border, fellow Palestinian writers, as political subjects with agency, rather than what kind of literary festivals make them into, which is like subjects of sorrow, of pity, subjects that we are instructed to attempt to save, rather than co-contributors to the world that we live in, right? And I think that that's something, I make that point to say that the organizing also shows you something different about the cultural realm and the cultural sphere. It reveals what is possible, and you know what we could think about the ways that we like write about each other, and the ways that we represent one another in fiction and in cultural spaces. I guess I'll end by, I wanted to ask you all what your vision for the books industry is, right? So we've been talking about the necessity of divestment, but I think maybe there's a follow-up question, which is then what happens next? And Yara, you were saying that, you know, Baillie Gifford's contribution to Hay Festival is actually minuscule. So there is a kind of window of possibility in terms of how we could remake these festivals and therefore put internationalist solidarity at their center. So I wanted to end on that question of, you know, what is your vision for the books industry, and what would it look like if not dominated by corporate sponsors and finance capital?
So really as quickly as possible, but I guess imagine a festival that wasn't paying the fees of writers with money made from arms companies and the destruction of communities and homes and livelihoods in the global south. But beyond festivals, an industry where profit is distributed more equally among workers and isn't hoarded by a few. Most people are working for way under a living wage. And then one also where, for example, as these festivals lost public funding following austerity, they actually expanded and started to look away from their local communities. So part of the reason why they're so reliant on corporate money is because they became so big. So Hay has locations all over the world. It's not just like a festival in Wales. So what you'd want really are festivals that are rooted in their local communities and don't just helicopter in Hillary Clinton, who was helicoptered into Hay, but you know, when you invite writers from other countries, it is about building solidarity, and it's not just about read us a poem that will make us feel sad, give us that cathartic feeling, convince us that we really are good liberals who do humanize people who are different to us for half an hour at this literary festival, but actually encourage us to change like materially change the world, to organize. And it's, you know, the biggest coup ever that whoever it is, that American philosopher has convinced us that the best thing a novel can do is convince us to empathize for a couple of hours with somebody else. Like a novel can convince us to live entirely different lives, to imagine the world structured completely differently. Its limit is not, you know, empathy for a day.
Yeah. Where next? Look, I mean, to kind of answer this lady's question, it's supposed to be about Palestine. If you're not understanding the ways in which the finance sector located in the City of London, the arms industry located in the UK, the entire, in many ways, British economy and global economy, which is now so monopolistic and so concentrated that most of the horrific activities that are taking place in most parts of the global south, most of the conflicts that are taking place in the world, including in Gaza, also in the Congo, wherever else, are profiting wealthy people in our own country, then I don't know what to tell you. Like, the next step is using the cultural power that we have to disrupt these institutions, to disrupt people profiting off death and destruction and chaos. And that is basically what our economy is built on.
I think for me, it's, you know, I'm thinking about Edinburgh, for example, like, every week there are blockades of arms factories, just as everywhere, like in lots of different places in the UK, because they're at our doorstep, right? These are the people who are making the parts that go and bomb Gaza. And at the same time, in the same city, you've got these cultural spaces. So for me, it's about bringing those two together, because they should be working together. Like, it should be that materially concrete, I think, for me.
Thank you all so much. I guess I will also end by saying, as long as there is a book industry, there are workers, right? And as long as there are workers across the world, it is our responsibility in every single way that we can within the industries in which we are situated to ensure that other workers do not die, essentially.
Yeah.
And that's a very serious and lifelong task. Thank you so much for giving us an insight into the kind of strategy of fossil-free books and for being here. Thank you so much all for being such a wonderful audience.